Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the PI coordinator call this morning. We will be going over the same information that was presented at the community conference. Mike will be starting us out today. I just wanted to do a couple of housekeeping things. You are all muted. If you have a question during the course of the call, please click the little hand icon that you should see on your screen, or go ahead and type something into the chat box, and we will make sure we see those questions there. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Mike to get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thanks.
Perfect. So if you wanted to start the slides from the beginning, we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome, everyone. I am Michael Kappelman, not Shahzad Saeed, but that is okay. And we will continue on with slide 3. And Michelle, maybe you want to change this to the slide presentation mode on the upper left where it says from current slide.
I will. I need to show my other screen. So just keep going and I will do that while you talk. Thanks, Mike.
All right, great. Can you go back to the welcome? Yeah. So thanks to all of you for joining the call and for continuing on our epic journey known as Combine. This is a journey to answer one of the most pressing clinical questions in all of pediatric IBD and to demonstrate that we as a pediatric IBD community and Improve Care Now in particular are willing and able to roll up our sleeves and get this and other high impact research studies completed because after all, we owe it to our patients and families as well as ourselves. Next slide. We have a busy agenda for today. We'll start off with some overview of study progress, where we're at with recruitment and retention. We will review all of the activities that we as sites need to be doing after recruitment and during our 104 week or 2 year follow-up period. I need to relay some information to you all about our April Data Safety and Monitoring Board meeting and some other safety info. All good news, generally speaking. We will switch gears a little bit and talk about the new protocol amendment that was just approved by the Central IRB and emailed to you all last week. And then we will end with a informed consent boot camp that Stephanie Sullivan, our regulatory specialist, will lead all in 55 minutes or less. Next slide. In terms of site activation and recruitment, I think you all know by now that we have 42 sites that we have selected. We have 39 activated sites and 148 patients randomized as of a few weeks ago. This is now somewhere in the mid 150s. And we've randomized about 35 to 40 patients in 2018. 29 sites have recruited at least one patient, and our leaders are Cincinnati, the Children's Hospital of the King's Daughter, and Stanford. Next slide. This is study-wide, how we are doing with recruitment. The green line is where we hoped we would be over time, and the blue line at the bottom is the actual number of patients randomized. And so we are significantly below our target and running about a year or so behind schedule. But the good news is that blue line is continuing to go up, and we are making progress just much slower than we had anticipated. So for all of our centers, we really need to get things turbocharged. Next slide. Which should also look familiar to you. Again, this is now a couple weeks old at this point, but it shows the number of patients recruited at each center. And you can see the number of centers on the left side that have recruited 10 or more patients continues to increase, which is great. We continue to add some new centers to the right side of our graph, but we ultimately need this graph to become even wider so that all of our centers are engaged and recruiting, and even taller because we need many more patients to make this project a success. Next slide. Just some high-level recruitment points. Collectively across all of our centers, we have pre-screened now over 1,000 patients, and 78 of patients who were potentially eligible were approached. And so this really reflects an amazing amount of work in pre-screening and approaching patients. In aggregate, about a third of our patients who we approach will consent, but there is a lot of variability across sites in both patient identification, approach, and consent. And I think we definitely have an opportunity to improve our consent rate. In other words, the number of patients who we approach that ultimately say yes, by doing best practices like warm handoffs, really engaging each individual patient's treating clinician as that source of confidence, and by having teams work together on a regular basis to review who's starting anti-TNF, how do we approach them, what's the best coordinated approach, and really coming up with an effective solution each and every time. We can do a better job, and we will be convening some calls over the next couple of weeks that we are calling sort of brief recruitment check-ins or huddles to really sort of delve into sharing of some of these best practices. Next slide. I thought you may all want to know who the patients are that have been enrolled in Combine. This is data based on our data lock from January 31st. About 70% of our Combine patients are male. The mean age is 14 years. About 80% are white, 9% Black or African American, and 7% unknown. About 74% of patients have initiated anti-TNF therapy with infliximab, the other 26% adalimumab. Next slide. So beyond recruitment, what is it that we need to do and be working on? So we have nearly 150 patients randomized to date. Over 125 remain active and in follow-up. If recruitment metrics hold, we expect the number of patients in active follow-up to double in the next year. And so we need to be well positioned at all of our sites to have super tight, well orchestrated processes to support follow-up activities. Next slide. Again, we have a 2-year period of follow-up as far as clinical trials go. This is a really long time. This is a marathon, or at least a half marathon. When we're following patients for clinical care, again, this is a high-risk population of Crohn's patients undergoing a high-risk treatment of anti-TNF with or without methotrexate. So close follow-up and frequent follow-up is needed. The Combine protocol specifies a minimum follow-up at week 4, week 14, week 26, and quarterly thereafter, with some windows around each of these dates, because we do anticipate that you all are nesting Combine follow-up into your routine clinical care. As a result, we understand that there may be good reasons why some patients aren't seen at 1 or more suggested visit intervals. That's okay. It happens. They are protocol deviations, and we'll have you document them as such, but not a major deal. We also know that some patients are seen more frequently than this or outside of the visit windows. These are all considered additional visits, and we need those to be entered into both the Combine databases as well as the Improve Care Now registry. Next slide. So the key things to do at follow-up, first and foremost, is to provide good, appropriate clinical care. That includes taking a history and doing a good physical at every encounter. And in doing so, with or without knowledge, providers are assessing the clinical status of each patient, assessing for study endpoints, which ultimately reflect both the safety and effectiveness of treatment, and assessing for AEs and SAEs. Clinical labs are done as part of standard of care. to assess both safety as well as response to treatment. These are your CBCs, your liver enzymes, your SED rates, and CRPs. These are part of clinical care. They're done routinely. They're ordered through your regular lab. They don't need to be done by a special trained study investigator. They can be done by each patient's clinician or nurse practitioner or whoever their provider happens to be. Importantly, the study PI or coordinator can coach the providers to order the right labs and complete the necessary assessments. But all of this is essentially standard of care. What are the combined specific activities that follow up? They largely are entering all of the data and assessments that are made as part of clinical care into the Combine or Improved Care Now registry forms, completing the provider review and study medication continuation, discontinuation forms when appropriate. Some visits require patient-reported outcomes, biosample collections, and those are done as part of the Combine protocol as well. All of these combined specific activities should be done by designated study staff, can only be done by designated study staff. So everything on the top of the screen, any treating provider can do those. Anything at the bottom of the screen, these are combined specific activities to be done by Combine staff. Next slide. Primary endpoints, again, these are sort of a composite clinical indicator of treatment effectiveness and safety. These are assessed at every visit and sometimes between visits. For a patient who is hospitalized or has surgery between visits, they have met a Combine endpoint, and the Combine study teams need to be aware of these. For the patient who develops intractable nausea between visits, and that nausea is managed by phone, that also is or may be a Combine endpoint, particularly if treatment is stopped as a result. And so the study team needs to be aware of what happens both during and between visits. When patients experience a endpoint, we need consistent documentation of that endpoint across all sources, and we need to take action to discontinue study medications. And so if a patient was hospitalized, we need documentation of that hospitalization in the in the Improved Care Now registry in the hospitalization form, and then we need evidence of that hospitalization in the Combine form and signed off on the provider review. For all patients who meet an endpoint and discontinue treatment, they remain in the study. They don't stop the study. They're not withdrawing from the study. They remain in the study, but off of medications for the full 2 years. In terms of sort of record keeping and housekeeping and noting all of these primary endpoints, many sites find it helpful to review all enrolled patients on a monthly basis, sometimes more frequently than that, identify which patients are due for which visits and when, get them scheduled, and just review the clinical status and phone notes and things to make sure that that patient has or has not met an endpoint, and if an endpoint has been met, that the appropriate measures have been taken to stop medication, and record all of that in the Combine forms on the electronic case report forms. Next slide. I'm going to skip over this slide, but it is here for your records. This is cut and pasted from the protocol, and it is a reminder to you all of the different component endpoints of our composite endpoint. All of these sort of reflect sort of success in inducing or maintaining a steroid-free remission. For a patient who meets any of these endpoints, they are essentially considered a treatment failure. Next slide. So I just wanted to review a little bit about how we're doing across all of our sites with follow-up and data collection for Combine. Next slide. And so here's a summary of patient status, again, based on the late January data lock. At the bottom, you can see this was the first 126 participants enrolled in Combine. Of these, 67% remain active in follow-up and on-study drug. 16% remain active and in follow-up, but off of study drug. Many of them have met a primary outcome and appropriately discontinued therapy. There are a couple of patients who made a cognizant decision to stop treatment on their own in the absence of meeting a primary endpoint. 4 patients withdrew prior to the first medication shipment. They basically signed the consent and went home and had a last-minute change of heart. And 2 patients withdrew after the, 3 patients or 2% withdrew after the first medication shipment. Next slide. Here is a list of our combined study visits and how frequently we have completed those. By definition, 100% of patients have had a screening visit. They wouldn't be able to be randomized without having had a screening visit. After that, you can see as we go from visit 4 to, from week 4 to week 65, we have logged in somewhere between 81 and 100% of required visits. And so for a pragmatic trial that we nest in routine care, this is not perfect, but pretty good. Next slide. Please do try to get patients in during their follow-up windows. Again, we know that it's not always possible. If it doesn't happen, record it as a protocol deviation, but we're not going to jump on you or be terribly upset. And a new amendment, which we will talk about later, has expanded some of these visit windows that should make it a little bit easier for you and your sites. Next slide. You can use the patient schedule report that I've taken a screenshot of at the bottom of this slide to help sort of track patients and when they are due for visits. The report has a few bugs and glitches, and we are in the process of updating it, hopefully to be released at the end of May. But in the meantime, it still does provide some useful information. It will be even more useful when we release the upgraded version. And I think this is something that can be and should be reviewed regularly with the PI or by the PI and coordinator. Next slide. In terms of data completeness, so we're doing a pretty good job getting patients in for follow-up, but we do not have the most complete data as of yet. And I think the biggest area around missing data is the data that comes from the Improved Care Now registry. So as a reminder, at screening and for every follow-up visit, the combined databases expand on the data that is already collected and recorded in the Improved Care Now registry. And so for every combined visit, we also need a visit entered into the Improved Care Now registry. I have highlighted in yellow the data that comes from the Improved Care Now registry, and you can see that the frequency of completion of these is much lower than the other fields which are collected in the combined database itself. The first 2 items at the top, I think, really tell the story quite completely. When you order a CBC, it comes as a bundle. You get both a white count and a hematocrit. Why then do we have the white count logged 100% of the time or 90% of the time and the hematocrit significantly less? Again, it's because the hematocrit gets logged into the registry forms, and we across sites need to be much more diligent about keeping that Improved Care Now registry complete and up to date. If not practice-wide, please, please, please make sure to do this for your combined patients. Next slide. You can use the exception reports here to help identify data deficiencies and address them and correct them proactively before our study monitor and monitoring team approaches you to fix these errors. If you stay ahead of the game, you will avoid a nasty gram from us. Next slide. All right, so I did want to talk a little bit about adverse events and what we can be doing to record these a little bit better. So we have had 145 adverse events reported to date. Of these, 20 are still listed as ongoing, and many of them have been ongoing for more than a month. including some infections from over a year ago. Presumably these infections have resolved themselves. And so please review your AE report regularly and add the end dates for AEs when they are resolved. Next slide. This is an example of an AE report. I am the guilty party. This is actually from my site. You could see at the bottom there, there are a couple of AEs without an end date. And so the outcome is listed as ongoing. Some of these are from a long time ago and have now clinically resolved themselves, but our site had not yet bothered to put in an end date and change the outcome. I'm pleased to report that since this slide was made, our site has corrected these deficiencies. But this is something that you all can do proactively. Look at your adverse event report, and those that actually have resolved, put in an end date and close them out. Next slide. How are we doing with collecting PRO forms? Overall, we're doing pretty well. This slide here shows the visits where PRO forms are due: visit 1, visit 3, visit 4, and visit 6. And we've gotten forms from over 90% of patients who have made these visits. So while it would be great to have PROs on 100% of patients who have made these visits, I'm pretty pleased with how we're doing as of now. Next slide. And so this is just a plug to be proactive and use all of the reports that we have created for you. We have about a dozen reports that you can use to be proactive and identify which patients need what. And we will be, as soon as the last couple of reports are updated and bugs fixed, we'll be providing a training for all of you later this summer. But in the meantime, as you're using reports, if you notice any bugs or things that just can't be right, please let us know so we can add that to the fix list. We've heard from you all over the last year about many of the bugs that you all have identified. We have fixed most of the ones that we've heard about, but please do keep us aware. We are only we can only test so much up front, and if you notice something that's not working, let us know so that we can fix it. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to move on a little bit and talk about our April DSMB report. Next slide. So our DSMB met on April 23rd. There were no unexpected safety signals identified, and they gave us their blessing to continue with recruitment and follow-up. Next slide. This slide here summarizes the adverse events reported in more than 2% of the population. Nothing surprising here. The other at the top was a smattering of all kinds of things under the sun without any clear patterns that emerged there. And amongst the common AEs, not unexpectedly, are nausea, vomiting, some infections, some abdominal discomfort, some headaches. Only 3% had elevation of their liver enzymes, which I thought was interesting and perhaps reassuring in terms of low-dose methotrexate. And I'll let you look at the less frequent ones at the bottom of this slide. Next slide. We've had 10 serious adverse events reported as of February this year, and you can see what they are on this slide. And I just wanted to remind you that AEs or SAEs related to the progression of the underlying Crohn's disease do not necessarily need to be reported as AEs or SAEs. If you are sure that a patient has a perirectal abscess and it's due to their Crohn's disease and you expect it as part and parcel of Crohn's, you don't need to report that as an AE or SAE. You are fine to do so if you'd like. It's totally at the discretion of the investigator. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to continue on and tell you a little bit about some of the protocol updates that were just approved a couple weeks back. Next slide. So protocol version 7.0 was approved by the Cincinnati Children's Central IRB. You all have received a copy of this last week, and these slides highlight some of the key findings. But don't use these slides as a cliff note only. Please do familiarize yourself with the entire protocol and the summary of changes in the beginning of that protocol. Next slide. So the inclusion criteria were clarified to allow for the use of infliximab or adalimumab biosimilars, as is becoming an increasing trend. The exclusion criteria, we increased the BMI cutoff from, we used to exclude patients whose BMI was greater than the 95th percent. We had a lot of patients on the bubble that sites really wanted to include. And so we have changed that criteria so that we now exclude patients whose BMI is greater than or equal to the 98th percentile. So if you have a patient whose BMI is 97.99999, go ahead and randomize them. You do not need an exception from me. We also clarified a bit about C. diff. If a patient is C. diff positive, but you think it's colonization, that's okay. If a patient tests and is C. diff positive, and they've been under treatment with antibiotics and you feel like the infection is now under control, that's okay as well. We just don't want you to randomize patients into COMBINE if they have active, ongoing, untreated C. diff infection. Next slide. This is a biggie here. So we previously wanted patients to be enrolled in COMBINE either 35 days before or within 35 days following the initiation of anti-TNF. And we have broadened this by a week. So we want now patients to be enrolled in COMBINE either 6 weeks or 42 days before or up to 42 days after their first dose of anti-TNF. So this just gives you a little bit of extra time to consent, enter data, and sign off. For a patient who's getting infliximab at 0, 2, and 6 weeks, if the site works quickly, the patient can consent on day 42, and we can get that data entered and the patient randomized within those 42 days. Next slide. Pregnancy testing, there was a lot of confusion about when the pregnancy test must be done. We had previously written that the pregnancy test must be done 2 weeks prior to the screening visit, but as we've realized when COMBINE played itself out, the screening activities were sometimes spread over multiple days, sometimes even weeks. And so we have set the date of randomization as sort of a hard date, and we expect that pregnancy is done within 30 days of the randomization date. And so this allows you a little bit more flexibility if there was a standard of care pregnancy test done, like maybe during a colonoscopy or something like that. As long as you get that patient randomized within 30 days of that standard of care lab test, you can use that. Otherwise, you are always free to use the study supplied pregnancy test kits that you all should have received from us. Next slide. In terms of treatment regimen, we just added in a little bit of clarification that some sites and some providers under routine circumstances advise their patients to hold or not take the folic acid on the day they take their methotrexate. If that is the practice of your provider or your site, you can do so with the COMBINE study as well. On the day the patient is supposed to get methotrexate or folic acid, on the day the patient is supposed to get study drug, whether it be methotrexate or placebo, if you want them to hold their folic acid, that is totally fine. I personally see no reason to do so. I think it probably is overly complicated. I always recommend my patients take the folic acid on a daily basis. That's the way the protocol is written, but the amendment provides your site a little bit of flexibility if you prefer to do things differently. Next slide. We did provide some clarification around primary study endpoints, and particularly a elevated SPCD-AI, short pediatric Crohn's disease activity index, that may not be due to IBD reasons, does not need to count towards that primary endpoint again. So we have a primary endpoint that says the SPCD-AI being elevated, indicating the patient is not in remission at 2 or more visits. That becomes a treatment failure. But if you think and the provider thinks that the SPCD-AI is falsely elevated, they had a bad day in school, and so their general well-being is poor, they have rotavirus or the flu and they're having diarrhea for non-Crohn's disease reasons, you can indicate that on the case report forms, and that does not count towards meeting a primary endpoint. We also added in some clarification that if a patient switches from infliximab to a biosimilar or adalimumab to a biosimilar, that does not constitute the study endpoint of discontinuing the anti-TNF. Again, biosimilars and originators are treated the exact same for the purpose of COMBINE. Next slide. Follow-up off of study medication. So this is really important here. Any patient who meets a primary study endpoint or who discontinues their first-line anti-TNF for Crohn's disease for any reason must discontinue study medications. Patients may also choose to discontinue study medications for whatever other reasons they have. They just are poorly compliant, they change their mind, whatever it may be. It is really unfortunate when patients discontinue study medications, particularly when they discontinue it in the absence of meeting a primary endpoint, but that happens. When a patient stops medications, that is not an early termination. They continue to be followed for the entire 104-week study unless they specifically ask to withdraw consent for the remaining study procedures. Next slide. And so an early termination, or withdrawal of consent means that the patient chooses to fully discontinue participation in the trial and not just discontinue study medications. It is really, really rare that a patient should withdraw consent. We get that sometimes patients just stop taking medicines and that's just the way of the world, but very rarely do they say, you know what, I just don't even want to be part of the study anymore. Next slide. So when we have patients who stop medications either because they've met an outcome or because they changed their mind, here is what we do when we follow them. We do our routine study visits and standard of care labs according to the visit schedule. We collect their PROs according to the visit schedule. For biosamples, we collect the first sample after treatment discontinuation. The second sample after treatment continuation may be skipped. For adverse events, we continue to collect and record adverse events for 14 days following their final dose of study medication. For SAEs, we collect and record them for the entire duration of the 104-week study. For pregnancy, we collect and report on those for 16 weeks after the final dose of study medication. Next slide. The visit windows, as I mentioned earlier, were expanded, particularly for visits 1 through 4, where we noticed that sites were having a hard time getting patients in at the assigned times. And so hopefully this will accommodate clinical practice a little bit better and minimize the out-of-window visit protocol deviations. The revised window schedule is shown at the bottom of this slide here. We've increased the number of weeks sort of plus or minus for the week 2, 3, and 4 windows. And I do want to call your attention to visit 2. And so visit 2, for most circumstances, will be after the patient starts study medication. And the main purpose for that visit 2 or week 4 visit was to grab a CBC and set of liver chemistries to make sure that the patient isn't having any safety concerns, either from recently starting anti-TNF or for starting study medication. If the visit 2 happens to be before the patient starts study treatment, or 7 or 8 weeks after the patient starts study treatment, please do obtain labs somewhere 1 to 6 weeks after the patient starts treatment. That way we can get a read as to how they're doing from a safety perspective. Next slide. For phone follow-up, we modified the language in the protocol to get rid of the word phone, and we just now say follow-up contact. Again, a lot of this deals with has the patient received study med from the central pharmacy, and do they have any questions for the study team about that? And while phone is preferred, any type of contact we will accept, whether it be email or text, or sometimes that second visit happens within a couple days of the patient receiving medications, and that's fine too. Next slide. Clarification around additional labs. So we've noticed that many times patients come in for infusions and a whole battery of labs are done, and sites have said, hey, do we have to enter all of these labs into the combined additional lab form for every infusion? And the answer is no. We only expect you to enter sort of these routine infusion related labs if it's a follow-up of a prior abnormal lab result. Maybe the liver enzymes were high or the white count was low. If that lab was a specialty lab like a calprotectin or an anti-TNF level, or if the labs were drawn as a result of a change in the patient's clinical status. But if they just come in for a random infliximab infusion, everything is hunky-dory, you don't need to enter those labs as a non-visit associated lab form. Next slide. Adverse events. So with just a little bit of clarification around the definitions. I'll let you read the top part on your own, but not dwell on it. A little bit about when to record AEs and SAEs. So the reporting period of non-serious AEs are within 14 days following the last dose. For SAEs, report those from the date of randomization through the week 104 visit and 14 days following that final dose. Next slide. Again, some definitions about related and expected that I'll let you review in the protocol itself. Next slide. And I do need to let you know about a black box warning for methotrexate that says, use caution when administering methotrexate after a recent history of nitrous oxide administration, as it may result in potential increased toxicity, such as stomatitis, myelosuppression, and neurotoxicity. This is largely based on high-dose methotrexate used to treat pediatric leukemia. I don't know that this is at all relevant to the low dose that we are using in Combine, but the FDA black box warning does not pin the warning to particular doses. My opinion personally is that this is a non-issue, but if you have a patient who's getting nitrous oxide anesthesia and you want to have them hold their weekly study med dose, that is totally fine and may be appropriate to cover your ASS and mine. Next slide. Okay, so in the last 15 minutes, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie Sullivan, our regulatory specialist, to talk a little bit about consenting. Across all of our sites, we have had a number of consenting errors, and you know, the bottom line is that informed consent is a key principle in conducting ethical research. We really want to be sure that patients are joining this study for the right reasons and that they understand the study that they are signing up to. The other thing is that the consent is an easy piece of paper to audit, and if it's not done properly, it raises red flags, and an external auditor, such as an IRB, wonders if the study team is being sloppy across the board if the easy thing to audit, the consent form, isn't done properly. So I'd really like to thank Stephanie for being on this call and providing us a refresher course on consenting so that we can make sure that each participant is fully informed and that informed consent is properly documented. So go ahead, Stephanie. Stephanie, are you on? We can't hear you.
Stephanie, you should be able to unmute yourself. If you cannot see your pin, Stephanie, it's 45, and then hit pound. I wonder if Stephanie was having a problem with her phone earlier. Mike, would you like to get started? And then Stephanie, when you are able to unmute yourself, if you, oh, it looks like, Stephanie, are you there?
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
We can now, thank you.
All right, take it away, Stephanie.
Sorry about that, just had a little trouble unmuting. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay, great. So thanks, Mike, for the introduction. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining and go ahead and get started on the boot camp. I'm just making sure, Michelle, there's no echo. Can you hear me okay?
There's a slight echo, Stephanie, but I think we should go ahead unless you think there's a quick way to fix it. It's not too bad.
How do I get that to go away on my computer?
Are you on the phone and the computer?
I'm on both, but I'm muted on the phone.
And you're talking through your computer?
Yes.
I don't know.
Okay, I'll just keep going and get started.
Yeah, if everyone else can mute, it might help, but otherwise just keep going, Stephanie. I think it's fine.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and do an update on the Central IRB. What we have had happen was the Central IRB was causing a little bit of issues with EPASS, so we'll talk about that. And then we're going to review some consent lessons learned, and then review some of the Cincinnati Children's IRB policies as well, and go over any questions that you might have. Next slide. So just a little bit of background that the combined study is a large central IRB, and it ended up breaking the Cincinnati Children's IRB. So what that means is that each center has been provided with their own IRB number. So just to make you aware, that came out in March, and each center was sent an email with their individual consent forms. So just making sure that you receive those and check your email. Anytime there's an email that comes from me, please make sure that you go ahead and open that and make sure that you receive those IRB documents. And that is the only way you're going to be able to receive those documents from the Central IRB. So just make sure you open my emails and read those and take those documents. And if you're required to, please submit those to the Central IRB. Please submit the Central IRB documents to your local IRB if you're required to do so. Go to the next slide. So as Mike mentioned earlier, there were a significant number of consenting deviations noted at IRB continuing review. And we're going to review those deviations and just do some lessons learned and go over the informed consent process as a whole in reference to those deviations, just to make sure everybody's on the same page and understands what's required for proper informed consent. And then we're going to go over those SOPs together from Cincinnati Children's, and then review what is called the informed consent process note. And we'll discuss that in full, and those have already been communicated to your site. So if you have a chance to open that email from Michelle, you can go ahead and open those up and we can look at those together as well. Next slide. So as far as informed consent goes, the most important part is making sure that families understand this is a research study. This is different from clinical care. This is an opportunity that we're sharing with them, and it's completely voluntary. What we do know from clinical research trials is that consents are long and complex, and the interventions that have been developed to improve informed consent have had mixed results. So basically trying to simplify the process, it hasn't worked. It's still a long documentation process, but it's also just extremely important. So I think that's the kind of complexity that we've tried to overcome, but just hasn't been successful. So many patients, what they have found, don't understand the key information about the study. So they walk away from the consent not understanding what's required of them, what the purpose of the research is, and kind of walk away feeling like they signed up for something that they don't totally understand. So it really is our obligation as researchers to make sure the patient understands the consent enough for it to be meaningful to them. So what I mean by meaningful is that they may not understand every single point of the consent because it's very long, but what they need to walk away with is understanding what they are being asked to do, how many visits they're going to have to go to, what's required as far as the intervention, what drugs they're going to be on. And that's our obligation to make sure they understand that before they leave. There also are some major implications for retention when it comes to informed consent. So the better that informed consent is done and more time is spent, typically results in better retention, meaning the families feel engaged, they feel informed, they feel like they understand what they're doing and are more likely to be adherent to the visits and what's required of them in the study. Next slide. So just a couple points that I'd like to cover from talking with some of the sites. I've noticed that they've discussed the study over several clinic visits, and then the family signed consent. What I'd like to make clear is that consent must be reviewed in full with the patient and parent, or with the parent, outside of a clinic visit where they have plenty of time to review it with you page by page, and then have plenty of time after the review to review it by themselves and ask any questions that they might have. So just having a few brief discussions during clinic visit is great. Definitely have those discussions, and however many appointments it takes, that's fine. But the actual informed consent discussion needs to happen separately outside of a clinic visit. It can be in a separate room, of course, but that just needs to be a sit-down process with the person that's consenting. So as I mentioned, the family must have adequate time to review, meaning at least 20 minutes or so to review the document and make sure they have all of their questions answered. One thing I'd like to clarify as well is that if a family brings back a signed consent that they took home to review without the full discussion of the consent, that does not qualify as informed consent. So if they bring a signed document back, and they say, yes, I want to do this. I read the whole thing. I totally understand it. I'm excited. You'll still want to have that separate informed consent discussion with a fresh document that they sign in front of you. The other piece is that detailed documentation of the informed consent process is required. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then also just reconfirming consent verbally and documenting that you talked with the family about it is really important for the trial. So patients often don't realize or understand that they're free to withdraw at any time without any of their care being compromised, meaning their care will go on as normal clinically if they say, you know what, I just don't have enough time to commit to the study, or something's come up in my family and I'm not able to do it anymore. That's completely fine. So just asking the question occasionally during the visit and making sure, do you still want to do this? You didn't sign a contract per se, you're volunteering, and we appreciate your time. So that's just going to be something to do, and document that you had those conversations with the family. That generally helps retention as well. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about consenting deviations that were identified either through the IRB continuing review or through monitoring. And these things have happened multiple times over. These are things that I know that I've experienced as a coordinator. I've made all of these deviations and I've learned from them. So it's just kind of bring them to your attention so that we can kind of slow down the consent process and make sure that we are doing what I consider the most important part of clinical research is proper informed consent. We're doing it really well, very carefully, very thoroughly. So a couple things that came up during continuing review were that the incorrect version of the consent form was used to consent the patients. Just as a note, when you receive a new consent form, please file away the older copies in your online archive and also destroy any printed versions immediately. That will help with preventing this error, and just making sure you update your regulatory binder and your share drive with your department so that there's no confusion about what's the most current consent form. There were also some date discrepancies on the signature pages of the consent form. And what I mean by that is that the dates differed between the consent and the assent form. Those dates need to match. And then also the dates that the parent signed the document or the adult signed the document and when the consenter signed the document. So those dates need to match unless there's very specific situations, which we'll talk about in a minute. So there were also some notes written on the actual consent document throughout the different pages where either the parent or the coordinator was writing notes. Those notes are fine. They just need to be written on a progress note or what we call an informed consent process documentation note. The IRB does not permit information to be written on the consent form unless there's very specific situations. And those questions just need to be documented elsewhere. So just keep that in the back of your mind as well. The other issue that came up was at a couple sites was that someone who was not the legally authorized representative provided consent or parental permission for the patient. It's really important to make sure that even though it's a biological parent, that they have legal custody of their child. There's been plenty of times where parents are together and they're biological parents, but they may not actually have legal custody based on, previous situations within the family. So just confirming that with the family is really important, and just taking it a step further. If grandma or aunt or uncle or whomever brings in the child regularly, that's fine that they bring them to clinic visits. They may have that ability, but they may not have legal custody to provide consent for research purposes. That's actually a state law-driven piece of consent for research. So just making sure you clarify that piece and obtained paper documentation if that is necessary for you to make sure 100% sure. So the other piece is to talk about signature blocks on the consent form. So some of those were completed incorrectly, and I completely understand that a lot of your centers are using a template that you're not used to using. You're using Cincinnati Children's template for the central IRB. So I definitely understand there's some confusion and it's not what you're used to looking at. So we'll just go over that briefly to clarify any concerns. And then if you have other questions, you can always ask me if your template looks a little bit different. Next slide. So this is the template signature block. And what you'll notice is I just made some highlights and some notes off to the right of the signature line. So the printed name of the research participant is always the either child or adult that has been diagnosed with pediatric Crohn's disease or Crohn's disease if they're an adult. So the other piece, the next line, is that the signature of the research participating indicating consent. This is only filled out if the study subject is 18 to 20 years old. So they would print their name and then sign consent for themselves. And that would be it for their piece. And then if you go down to the next line, it's the signature of the legally authorized representative. And that's if necessary, meaning if the participant is 0 to 17 years old, this will be signed by the parent/LAR. And the final line is the signature of the individual obtaining consent. This would be the person delegated by the PI to obtain informed consent. And you find out who's been delegated by looking at your delegation of authority log. And that's signed by each person working on the study and the PI signing off that they've made those delegations. So hopefully this will clarify any confusion. Feel free to print this slide and have it available when you go to consent next time. It might help with some clarity and prevent the errors that were found on the consent forms. Next slide. So these SOPs from Cincinnati Children's, there's two that we're going to circulate and put on SharePoint for you to review in full. I've just taken some excerpts out of them to highlight what I think are the most critical points, but of course the entire SOP needs to be followed. So I'm going to point out first, an important part of consent is actively soliciting questions from the family and asking open-ended questions, just making sure that they can articulate an answer to your question regarding the consent form. And then also, if their responses to those questions are not accurate or slightly off of what you would hope they would answer after being consented, use those questions to probe a little further to make sure they understand the research. It's just really critical you take as much time and slow down and ask a lot of questions to make sure they understand and that they feel comfortable. And then go ahead and next slide, please. Also for the informed consent standard operating procedure, consent is technically begins when the potential research participant is contacted about the study. So informed consent must be documented prior to study procedures being performed. We had a couple instances where there were some study procedures before consent. So just being careful that you understand which procedures are study related and which are clinical care. And Mike wanted me to point out that pre-screening and ordering of standard care labs can be done before consent. That's just routine standard care that can continue before consent. And we have a partial HIPAA waiver for pre-screening, which means you can go into the chart and look for patients that are eligible. That has been documented in the protocol. So you can continue to identify patients without consenting them first. And then standard of care labs are not ordered just for the sake of the research study. That's why those are permitted before patients are consented. So another aspect of the study that's really important to understand is that it's acceptable for the patient's physician or other members of the clinical team to approach a patient and family about the study and introduce the concept of the study. That's perfectly acceptable. Non-combined staff are permitted to provide a warm handoff to the actual combined study team, and those are the people that are IRB approved to actually conduct study related procedures. And that is not considered recruitment, the warm handoff piece. The actual process of recruitment and consent must be done by an official study team member. As I mentioned, those are the folks that are on the staff listing that's IRB approved by Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Any questions about that, just let me know. You can follow up with me by email. Next slide. The informed consent process note. This is a really important piece of informed consent. As I mentioned earlier, any questions that are asked by the family, asked by you, any topics of conversation about the study should be documented on a separate document. And then any reconsenting that's done, whether you've done that verbally, you can just document that in the informed consent process note. This is just as a clarification, this has always been required by the Cincinnati Children's IRB. We just haven't been firm about instituting it into Combine until now. So many institutions already require some version of an informed consent process note. Cincinnati Children's has required it for quite a bit of time. It's just something that's really critical to be able to produce that note and any questions, concerns about the consenting process to the IRB. The IRB in Cincinnati did ask for these notes at continuing review, and unfortunately I was unable to provide them because the centers weren't documenting it in this fashion with a separate note. So this is something really important that we need to be able to provide at a moment's notice to the IRB. Next slide. So I would like to also cover remote consent. We do have an SOP for obtaining consent when the individual is not physically present. Some centers don't abide by this, meaning they choose not to and they want to do the consent in person. I totally support that. But there are some centers that have this need for remote consent, which I completely understand. And I've done remote consents before very successfully with research trials, so it can be done in compliance with the regulations. Technically, the consent should be done directly with the individual via a conference call, video conference, or a web conference. the next step would be the participant or the legally authorized representative electronically transfers a copy of the entire signed and dated document to the research team, not just the signature page. So the entire document needs to be submitted. And the method and process used to obtain the consent, assent, and parental permission is documented on the signature page of the consent form, as well as the informed consent process note. So what's important there is this is the very specific instance where the IRB wants you to document on the actual consent form on the signature page what happened with the consent as far as it being a remote consent, and then also consent, documenting the consent process on the informed consent progress note. Next slide. Also, the IRB in Cincinnati approved a consenting process deviation. So we've submitted something to the IRB that basically stated that families are not going to always be able to submit their signed document the same day as required by the SOP. So what we did is we had an approval for there being a gap in time between when the consent was signed and then when the staff member that receives it signs it. So for instance, if you did the consent today over the phone, the family signs it and wants to mail it back to you, and that will take a few days to come back, then you sign it when you receive it. That is acceptable to the Cincinnati Children's IRB. You just need to make sure you document all of that on the consent form and then on the progress note. That's a separate document. The other thing is families can bring it back, either in hand. So if you consent them and they come back 2 weeks later, that's acceptable. All versions of the gap in time are acceptable. And I would say if the gap in time becomes a little bit too long for your comfort, always feel free to reconsent them in person and just document that you did that. Always better safe than sorry. The other thing is we're going to have you upload the informed consent process note with your consent form to the consent management system as a standard part of the process. Next slide. So we actually have circulated the combined informed consent process note template that we will ask you to fill out. If your center has something similar to this, please communicate with your IRB. You don't have to fill out both of those documents. You just need to fill out the one that your IRB is most comfortable with. Since Cincinnati is your IRB of record, your IRB may say, yes, go ahead and use Cincinnati's. You don't have to fill out ours. If your IRB has strong regulations about them using yours, even though you're relying on Cincinnati, go ahead and use your document. Just make sure that you're uploading that with your consent form so we can review that. And so our monitor, Janine, can review that as well, and that you can be able to produce that at any time for the IRB. We're gonna post these SOPs on SharePoint, so just take some time. They're only a couple pages long, maybe less, that you review that very, very carefully, and that you adhere to that process when you're consenting families. Please store those in your regulatory binder as well. And then, review that in full. And if you have questions or concerns, you can definitely contact me. And if you're uncertain what your IRB may require, or if you're not sure which one to fill out, like I said, just contact your local IRB, get those questions answered, and you can circle back with me if you want to talk about it further, about how you're going to go through your informed consent process and remain compliant with the Cincinnati Children's SOPs, but also make sure that you're compliant with your local IRB. Next slide. I think that's it. So hopefully if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to contact me directly, and we will get everything answered for you, hopefully in a timely fashion.
Thank you, Stephanie. Mike, do you have anything to add before we end the call?
Just my thanks as well.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.